Probably unmuted it. There we go. Hello and welcome. Welcome to our 17th lecture and the third one that deals with one of the things that states do, in other words, public policy, and the variation in that public policy across cases. Now today we're hopefully going to discuss something that is of great interest to you, not only because of the current political situation in which we see increasing segments of society take an interest in environmental policy, but also, of course, because this affects all of you. In a sense, I'll be dead a couple of years before you, so I don't have to care all that much about it, but you should care very much about how you, yeah, I know I intend to live to 120, but who knows, we're never quite sure. So today we're going to be talking about environmental policies, and I'm going to start this by saying that I lied to you a little bit on this particular slide, because it's going to be impossible to cover all aspects of environmental policies, simply because that field is too vast. So what we're going to do mostly today is actually going to be talking about public policy that intends to combat climate change. So sometimes I will use environmental policies and climate policies synonymously. That's not really, it just means I'm lazy. The actual intent of the lecture, though, is to familiarize you more with climate policies in particular. But that doesn't mean that some of the dynamics and actors and insights that we gain from looking at climate policy, of course, can't be also applied to lots of other areas of environmental policy, or indeed to other areas of public policy too. So we're going to be discussing a couple of key questions and concepts. We're going to be thinking about the dependent variable. What are these policies? What are we actually looking at here? We're going to be thinking about independent variables. What causes variation in these variables that we've identified in step number 2. And we're going to take a quick look at one or two case studies where people have tried to do exactly this, namely put their comparative politics hats on and look at environmental policies in different perspectives and with different goals, nevertheless in a very comparable manner. So I already said environmental policy is fairly easily defined. It's not all that hard. It's public policy that addresses some sort of environmental problem. So problems that are threats or challenges mostly to how humans exist on this planet. And far from being simple, of course, or being simple to categorize, there's at least 3 distinct dimensions that these problems have, that we can categorize these problems into, these environmental problems. We have certainly a physical dimension where we might have problems with ecosystems as a whole. We might be thinking about deforestation. We might be thinking about drought. We might be thinking about rising sea levels and so on. So there's this physical dimension. But that's really only one of them. There's at the very least another social dimension where we think of environmental problems as problems that have a social component or have an impact on society. So this can mean that public health is under threat. This can mean that we think about living standards, housing standards. So all social aspects of environmental policy can be categorized in this particular section. And then we certainly have an economic dimension of this. Environmental policies are influenced by economic decisions and for the most part have an influence on later economic decisions. So when we think about resource management, of course, we think about, for example, the costs that states have to shoulder as they try to move away from non-renewable energy. And of course, that has huge implications for infrastructure, for whole economies, for countries' pathways, for decades and beyond. So there's at least 3 different dimensions to environmental problems, and you can keep these in mind because we're going to be coming back to them later. But almost all environmental problems have a physical dimension, but also a social and an economic dimension. And this partially is what makes them so challenging, is that they cut across issue areas in many ways. But any policy, anything the state does that addresses these sorts of challenges and addresses problems that arise from what we do to this planet, we can probably categorize under environmental policies. So I mean, I've tried thinking about this morning, and I couldn't really come up with all that great examples of things that go wrong on our planet that don't have our hand in it in some way. Most of the environmental problems today are, of course, human-created. even if we only indirectly change sort of circumstances or marginal variables, and then other things happen. So that's what we talk about when we talk about environmental policy. Now, let me move from environmental policy concretely to climate policy and think about where are policies that intend to combat climate change actually happening. And we see that another aspect that makes this issue area so challenging for states is not only that problems are interconnected and cut across issue areas, but also that the efforts to combat climate change happen on many different levels, and none of them is, at least on the face of it, unimportant in achieving our goals. So of course we have the global level at the very top. You can think about efforts at the UN, for example, to set binding or non-binding standards for states, but the problem is that there's very little hard law on the global level, and states mostly sort of self-bind themselves to whatever obligations they have. And of course we have the problem that whenever you have 193 countries in the room, it's very hard to generate consensus. Then we have a supranational level underneath that, which you maybe can also think about as like a regional level. So the European Union, of course, is a very important actor in climate change and at the forefront of efforts to combat climate change. And they can indeed issue binding regulations, at least on their members. But of course, this is only one region of the world. Europe alone probably can't save the planet. Then we have underneath this the national level, and this might be the level that we think about first when we think about climate change policy, because in lots and lots of states and regions of the world, climate change policy is still a national level issue. I mean, there's not all that many other areas of the world where regional organizations, such as the EU, have taken up the charge of developing climate change policy. The EU is the outlier in this regard. So states still, of course, have that key decision-making power because they can directly implement law, directly implement regulations that are intended to combat climate change, but they are sandwiched sort of from below and from above. And because they might get directives, or at the very least they might get norms from the global or supranational level, but there's also pressure from the bottom that might compel them to do certain things. So when we think about the regional level, underneath the state level, this is often a level that has real power in terms of implementing climate change policy, but of course also has real limits, namely that the smaller we get in terms of our territory that we regulate, I mean, it doesn't really, the more difficult does it get to generate sort of system-wide results. It's nice that you can arrange your backyard very nicely, but it's only one backyard, and again, one backyard alone isn't going to save the world. So while you have people with a lot of decision-making power on this level, it's also very limited in terms of geography and territory. And then lastly, you have the local level. If you go down to sort of city councils and things that can plant trees or ban cars from inner cities and so on. And oftentimes, these are actually the bodies that have to implement all these changes, even if they've been generated on the global level, and when they come down to them. But we have this problem called NIMBYism. I don't know how many of you have heard NIMBYism. Show of hands. NIMBYism? Okay, what does it mean? Not in my backyard, exactly. So that's the acronym for that. So climate change policy is great, but I think we're already doing enough, and I think the other guys should do things first. So kind of acknowledging that something is a sensible policy, but not wanting to be the first one that implements it, but thinking that others have the obligation first. That's NIMBYism. And that often happens on the local level because it's so easy to say, well, look, we're just one little slice of the world. Why doesn't the rest of the world step up first? And of course, we have communities and well, at the very end of the chain, even us as individuals that might make certain decisions that affect climate change or environmental problems. So we have a very multi-layered system, all of which, the elements of which all play a role in developing this policy and implementing it too. And that's part of what creates the problem. Now let's stay on this top level a little bit, because I also know that some of you that sit in here that have been thinking for 16 weeks, damn it, this is just a politics lecture, and where's all my IR stuff? Here's a bit of IR. Obviously, the bigger the problems get, the more global the problems get, the more important is the global and supranational level in comparison to other things that might be more confined to national state borders. So we have on the international level, of course, two big pieces of policy that have been developed in the past couple of years that you all know by name. You have the Kyoto Protocol, and you have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's what UNFCCC stands for. And these things were both developed on an international level. They were first separate, but they have more and more become sort of one thing. And you see this if you look, for example, at these climate change conferences like the last one in Paris in 2015. This conference is both a conference of the parties of the Kyoto Protocol and a conference for the members of the UNFCCC. So they basically just put both of them together and called it one big conference, even though it's about two very different things. And both of these protocols or policy efforts try to set some targets for states to combat climate change through, for example, the reduction of the emission of greenhouse gases. And now there's one big important difference between these two mechanisms that you should be aware of at least, even though we see some sort of institutional convergence here, like I just explained. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is a very nice document, but at its core it's non-binding. So you can sign it, but nothing really happens when you break it. And its main goal is to its main goal when it was created was to stabilize things, like to keep them at the level at which we are currently. States sort of self-report their progress, and then there's a couple of financial instruments and technology transfer tools and so that the UNFCCC has implemented that are supposed to help states get better at addressing climate change. And then on the other hand, you have the Kyoto Protocol, which is the more contentious one of the two, mostly because it actually is a binding international law document. So it's binding, and its goal is not just to stabilize things, but to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to combat climate change rather than just keeping everything stable. States also self-report, but there is a sanctioning mechanism integrated that is mostly based around not being able to access this market for emissions trading. The Kyoto Protocol's really innovative mechanism was this emissions trading, where states could sell off the rights to pollute to someone else, which sounds a bit weird at the start, but it would be the equivalent of you being really, really careful with your energy savings at home, not really spending all that much money on it. Say you only spend 20 pounds a week on your energy, but you've paid for 60 pounds. Then under emissions trading, you could sell the 40 pounds different to someone else who could then pollute more than you are doing it. Look into that mechanism, because it's a really innovative way to organize to incentivize states to do certain things that are market related and not just sort of relying on soft law or norms or kind of international treaties. So at least look into it. It'll be an interesting way to organize around international problems. Now, the Kyoto Protocol has had a pretty good adoption rate around the world, as you can see in this map here. But you can also see that there's a couple of key players that seem to have fallen out of this framework. So the blue world, for example, the blue world are all states that had goals to reduce their emissions in the so-called phase 1, so the early stage of the Kyoto Protocol. We're now in stage 2, and none of the blue states have any sort of obligations to reduce their emissions in the current phase of the Kyoto Protocol. And you see, that's most of the world, and of course it includes a couple of major polluters. You have the green world that has voluntarily agreed to reduce their emissions further. And you see this is mostly really an effort by, well, European states. There's a couple of Central Asian states in there and Australia, but nonetheless, the really only states with binding targets in the current version of the Kyoto Protocol are the green states. While that represents a good bit of the industrial capacity of the world, it's not all that many countries, and it certainly doesn't include all the polluters, especially if you consider cases like the US, which, of course, under Donald Trump has famously announced that they will withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, even though that hasn't happened yet, because it takes a while from you announcing it to you actually crashing out of the protocol. So this is an uneven international instrument, and in this current stage, despite of how much we celebrated that they came to an agreement in Paris, the Kyoto Protocol as it stands at the moment is mostly Europe reducing its emissions in order to save the rest of the world. Or I mean this in quotation marks, obviously. So who else is working on this problem? We talked about the supranational level already, which in our case mostly is the European Union. The European Union has set itself quite ambitious goals beyond the Kyoto Protocol itself. There's what's called the 2020 package, which aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by below 1990 levels by the year 2020. And the rare good news in environmental for the environmentally concerned, we have actually already surpassed this target. The EU has reduced their emissions by 23% already, and we still have a year to go. So at least in that regard, we're doing okay. And we've instituted our own emissions trading system, so kind of a smaller, like a baby version of the Kyoto Protocol that works for EU states, where EU states can trade emissions with each other, which again is meant to incentivize them to adopt climate-friendly policies because they can make money off it, essentially. So because it's almost 2020, the EU never sleeps, so they've already come up with the next package, the so-called 2030 package, which sets even more ambitious goals for the 11 years that we have left until 2030. And while this all sounds really great, I've put the graphic next to those bullet points, because what you see, of course, is, well, again, much like the efforts are unevenly distributed across the globe in the previous map, the efforts inside Europe are also unequally distributed. There's a couple of states that seem to be doing okay in terms of their climate change policies, say the ones at the top of the scale here, and I don't know if you can read that, but the numbers 1 through 5 are no great surprises to you probably. It's Sweden, Germany, France, Cyprus, and the UK. Well, Cyprus may be a little bit of a surprise, but anyway, that's the top 5. Interestingly enough, maybe you thought of other countries that are normally known to be environmentally conscious, like Finland or so, but they are middling around in the sort of in the middle of the table here. So not everyone in the EU, not every country, is making equal efforts to address climate change or adopting all these policies equally much. Partially, this is of course because they're differently economically developed. We probably wouldn't expect a highly industrialized country like Germany with a huge industrial capacity to reduce their emissions by the same degree as a still industrializing country such as Bulgaria or Poland or so. That's not to say that they are way behind, but they are not on the same. They're not yet on the same level as Germany is. So in other words, Germany sort of can afford to do this kind of stuff because they're already at the top, they already have the capacity and the know-how, while there's other states that are still on the road to the top of the league table. So quite ambitious though. Now, the main question that we can now have after having looked at the globe and maybe having looked at the EU is, and this is the question that really interests us as comparative political scientists, why are some states seemingly so much better at adopting climate change policies than others? So why do you have leaders in climate policy and why do you have laggards on the other side? So that's really the key question that interests us in this whole field. So if we think for a second about the dependent variable, so how do we actually measure what we said we wanted to explore? So how do we think about climate change policy? And you'll realize in a second that it's not all that self-evident how we're supposed to go about this. So if we ask about leaders or laggards, first the question that we have to settle is, are we looking mostly at policy outputs or policy outcomes? And this is, of course, a very major difference. Policy outputs are basically things that states vow to do. They make certain laws, they implement, they design certain programs, and so on. But until we measure the actual outcome of these policies, we don't know whether or not they've been successful. It's like your New Year's resolutions are all policy outputs. If you check on the 31st of December whether or not you've been successful in achieving your New Year's resolutions, that's your policy outcome. And we all know that, of course, that's not the same, otherwise I'd be in the gym right now. So policy output versus policy outcome is already the first really important dimension that we have to look at, and we have to make a choice here. Are we interested in the one side or in the other? There might be a good reason to look at only policy outputs. Maybe it's easier to measure. because we can just look at what laws are being passed, and then those that pass those laws are the good guys, and those that don't pass these laws are the bad guys. That's sort of easy to come up with. But of course, we could also make a fairly good argument that whatever policy outputs countries have really doesn't matter if they not also deliver on outcomes. So it's great that you adopted all these laws, but seemingly your industry still pollutes as much as before. So why should we care all that much that you adopted the laws in the first place? So we have to make a choice here. And there's not so much a wrong choice, but maybe a choice that we don't properly justify. And I think there's one essay question on this, isn't there? Yes? Yeah? Okay. So remember, this is one of the first questions that you have to solve in your essay too. Are you looking at everything, or are you looking only at a part of the equation? So once we've settled this in whatever way we want to settle it, we then have to think about who are we actually looking at. We know, of course, or we should know by the start of our study, who our unit of analysis is. Are we going to look at, well, the national level? Are we looking at national governments, what they do, what they implement? Are we looking at sort of the lowest level of politics? On the local level, what does Edinburgh do versus Aberdeen versus Glasgow to combat climate change? Or maybe, and I've actually forgotten to list this here, are we maybe looking at the supranational level mostly? Because there could be multiple organizations that are involved on the global level too that are trying to combat climate change. So we have to figure out a unit of analysis. We probably can't look at everything at once. So again, we have to make a choice here. What interests us the most, or what do we think generates the most interesting results? And of course, there's plenty of research on all of these levels. So you can't pick one of those and not find 50 research papers already that have done this kind of stuff. So if we want to categorize our actors then, we probably want not 2 but 3 categories. We want probably a category that collects sort of the leading states. So those states that are at the forefront of adopting climate change policy, that set themselves ambitious goals, that enact binding legislation, and all these kind of good things. And then we have on the other side probably the laggards that are either slow at adopting these sorts of policies, or maybe they're not adopting them at all. Maybe they might even, USA, maybe they might even try to sabotage global efforts. They might even try to deter others from implementing environmentally friendly policies. Now, we hope that we wouldn't find too many countries that fall into this particular category, but they're undoubtedly there. And then we probably have a third category, which are those that we can't categorize all that easily. There's always going to be states that we can't all that well classify just into the ambitious leaders versus the inefficient laggards, but they're just sort of in the middle. They're either going along with what everyone does, or they have a neutral stance. They kind of don't know where to go necessarily. Sometimes this might be countries with a low policy capacity, small states, for example, that just don't have a lot of resources to think about this kind of stuff, that have other problems to deal with besides enacting ambitious climate change policy, and so on. So there should be probably at least 3 categories, and then you can think again, should these categories be just binary, you are a laggard or a leader, or are there degrees? Can you be an ambitious leader, or can you be sort of a reluctant leader or something? Again, and you can be as creative as you want, more or less, in how differentiated you make the scale. So if we then look at policy outputs that these units, whatever unit we've agreed on, and what they generate, we again should probably look at the same categories that I introduced you to on the 3rd slide, namely these different aspects of environmental problems. What do these problems touch? So we could be thinking about in how far are the outputs that states generate intended to tackle the physical problems of what we do to the environment, of what we do to climate change. So this could be about reducing emissions. This could be about keeping your water clean, keeping your air clean. This could be about efficient waste management, and so on. But we probably, just like I said on the 3rd slide, we probably also want to think about the non-physical aspects of protecting the environment and protecting the climate. So we want to think about the social aspect of it, like which states have been good at promoting green values, which states have been good at getting their own citizens to be greener, so to say, which states have all gotten us to not use plastic bags anymore. We could also be thinking about different ways in which states incentivize particular behaviors. Something like the tax on plastic bags is one of those things. And so besides the social dimension, we should also probably look at an economic dimension in how states tackle environmental problems. We could be thinking about, are they taking the necessary steps, for example, to develop their industries further? Are they trying to get their industry away from non-renewables, away from carbon using industries and into low carbon usage? Are they building sort of efficient infrastructure and sort of systems that are well integrated and are not very wasteful? So again, like, we have to make a choice here, because we probably can't look at all of these, or maybe we want to if we keep the case selection fairly small. So in all these dimensions, we could be measuring what states actually do, what their output actually is. Now, what exactly do we measure here? Well, that's not just a given. We could be thinking about these outputs as binary. State A promotes green behavior, or state A does not promote green behavior. That's one way of doing it. But maybe we need a slightly more sophisticated scale. So let's take an example. Those that have started with their essay already or started researching their essay probably stumbled upon this already. It's the Environmental Performance Index. It's generated every year, and it's an index that is designed to measure how well states are doing in terms of their environmental policies. It consists broadly of sort of two halves, and you see the two halves in this nice round graph here. It thinks about environmental health, so how well are we humans doing in whatever environment the state creates, and it thinks about ecosystem vitality. How well is that state protecting sort of the natural resources that they have? And natural resources, not of course just kind of oil and gas, but like their entire natural environment. And this is a very nice indicator because it comes pre-made, so you don't have to make up your own indicators. It's on this nice scale from 0 to 100. It's very, very convenient to compare states with, because of course that's what it was designed to do. So what happens when we take a closer look at this? How does the world look through the lens of the EPI, the Environmental Performance Indicator? So we see this is a graph that correlates the two halves of the indicator. So at the bottom you see how good are your environmental health, how well are you people doing in relation to the environment, and you see on the vertical axis ecosystem vitality, how well are you preserving your natural environment. And you see that there's, well, I mean, if we draw a line, like a 45-degree line, we see that, well, most states sort of cluster around that line. Most states are sort of equally good or bad at providing both of these halves of environmental protection. We do see, though, and maybe this is interesting, we do see a couple of states that don't fall onto this neat line. So we see, for example, states such as China, who are actually doing okay on their ecosystem vitality, and this might surprise you or might not surprise you, but that have not yet managed to move their policies all that much up in terms of environmental health. So they're fairly good at protecting aspects of the environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they also can protect their entire population all that much from negative environmental effects. At least that's what the indicator implies. And then, of course, you have the maybe less surprising cluster of European states in the top right that seem to be doing both things sort of equally well and also the best globally. But you see, there is variation. It's not just that, for example, all of Africa ends up in the bottom left corner. There's a spread there. Actually, there's a spread there. There's variation there in almost every continent. So we see that this seems to be highly different. This is not just a given that whoever is good at the one thing, protecting one aspect of the environment, is also good at the other. If you're interested in how the UK is doing, and you should be, of course, because you're a part of it, well, I have good news and bad news. As you can see from this graph, the UK is pretty good, actually one of the world's best countries in terms of environmental health. So there's very few things in the environment in Britain that has negative effects on its citizens. So we rarely have, I don't know, giant bouts of smog, we rarely have droughts, and so on. But the UK is actually doing quite poorly when it comes to the other half of that indicator, namely ecosystem vitality. Like, come on, please, like, plant a few trees. I mean, so that's what each country has in itself, again, has a good bit of variation once you open this indicator up and look at what's inside of it. So if you use this indicator in the future or in your essay, it does make sense that once you look at a particular country, to look at, well, where does that overall index value actually come from? Is your country doing well because they're only doing one thing well, or are they doing well because they're doing all things well? So we have to take a close look at that. There's, of course, other ways to measure the dependent variable, measure how well states are doing in protecting the environment. One of the other famous ones is the Climate Change Performance Index. And now we're back at climate change and not kind of at all environmental policies. And this is an interesting index because it's collected by climate action NGOs. So these are really people that want to get their states to be better at combating climate change. The main NGO that's collecting this is an NGO called German Watch. I'm sure that has nothing to do with me. So they bring out a publication every year, and they rank states based, again, on a set of indicators that are supposed to measure how well they're doing in combating climate change. And you see that this is a fairly sophisticated measure. It's not just enough to have the right policy, of course. You also have to have measures in place to actually reduce your emissions, to increase the efficiency of your energy use, and to do more in terms of renewable energy. And then you see each sector again is split up in a couple of other points that are supposed to measure sort of sub-aspects of that particular index. So when we look at this indicator, the world looks a little bit different than it looked earlier with the EPI indicator. So the league, they look at 58 different countries, and the league table looks slightly different. We still maybe have sort of the usual suspects on top: France, Sweden, UK, Cyprus again. What's it with Cyprus? But for example, in comparison to an earlier indicator that we looked at, Germany, for example, is only in midfield here, 29th. So clearly whatever they're measuring seems to be generating a different ranking than what we had before. They're also, by the way, and I like this because it's a little bit sassy, they say, haha, we're not giving out the top 3 places in this ranking because no country is really doing enough to combat climate change. So ranks 1 through 3 are just empty. And then the best ever country starts at number 4. That's like almost a bit spiteful, like you're not even getting a bronze medal. No, you're getting nothing, even if you're doing the best you can globally. So anyway, but you see that there's a huge bit of variation, but of course that variation results in different rankings depending on what indicators you choose. So again, be careful about which indicators you choose, and you should absolutely know what goes into your indicator so you know what you're actually measuring. Now, let's move from the dependent variable. We've talked about outputs, outcomes, what a state's actually doing, to the independent variable. What could lead some states to be leaders, and what could lead others to be laggards? Why are some states good at this and some aren't? Well, maybe the first idea that you had is, well, this just depends on how differently affected by problems they are. Those that have a lot of environmental problems probably should be the most likely to also adopt policies that combat those. And those that aren't really affected, looking at you, Switzerland, those probably won't be extremely ambitious because it doesn't really concern them, in quotation marks. The problem with that is, though, that this functional pressure really isn't very selective. Nowadays, we're fairly certain that no one state in the world is going to just escape all aspects of climate change or environmental problems. And I love this map here because the European Union, because the Commission has collected which states, which areas of Europe they think will be especially affected by particular environmental problems. And you see there's no white spots here. Every place will have some problems associated with climate change or the environment. Even places in Central Europe where you might think, well, I guess sea levels rising isn't going to affect people in Geneva, and you're probably right, but you will still see, for example, that here in the center, in the Alps, you have all kinds of things that are associated with problems specifically in mountain ranges. So what I'm trying to show here is no one is immune, obviously, from functional pressures. No one is immune from climate change, so that alone doesn't really explain why some states are more ambitious and other ones aren't. And of course, I could put a global map on here. There's nice global maps about the sort of projected changes to the natural environment if climate change reaches a certain level. And you can see that almost all of the world is affected by this. Although, of course, there could be regions for whom climate change is positive, like in all seriousness, Siberia is going to be much better off under climate change because you suddenly have all these beautiful kind of evergreen forests, and you have a region that doesn't freeze constantly, and so on. But the majority of the world has to fight problems. So it can't just be functional considerations. It can't just be problem pressure. There must be other factors that explain why some states are better at this and others aren't. So, of course, we're political scientists. We should probably look at political factors first. So, for example, we could have the hypothesis that you need a strong and stable government to put proper environmental policies in place. If you're constantly dealing with crises, either, I don't know, even military crises, but also sort of crises of governing or so, you probably have other things to do rather than adopting ambitious climate change policies. Maybe it's EU membership. Once you're a member of the club, that just compels you to adopt the right climate change policies, because otherwise they won't let you in. There could, of course, also be non-political factors. There could be economic factors, for example, where you have to reach a certain level of economic development. Otherwise, you don't really care. Again, like if you have a very low level of economic development, you have other things to worry about than protecting your forests, for example. You have to worry, just as an example, about your people starving. You have to think about droughts, about huge unemployment, and so on and so forth, which are all things that, well, you could argue are more fundamental than doing this luxury thing that's climate change policy. So both political and economic factors might explain why some states are more willing to do this than others. You could also look at informational factors. Are there maybe countries that just know more about this and are more active in developing solutions and can adopt these solutions earlier? Or do you have to wait sort of until information filters down to you, which are called informational factors? And then, of course, there could also just be factors that are external to all of this and can't really be properly categorized. You could have external shocks. You think you're doing okay until a giant catastrophe hits you, and only then do you realize, we should probably change something. So Fukushima, right, isn't directly related maybe to climate change, but suddenly created the awareness in other states that weren't affected by this at all, weren't physically affected by this at all, that they should change their policies. So, and this, of course, that doesn't really fit into any of the other explanations because you can't anticipate these. You can't anticipate natural disasters, and you can't predict them either. So there might be these kind of factors too that could explain the variation in how much countries adopt climate change policies. So one of the examples of how to do this is, I think, in your readings for this week, which is a study by Lieferink from 2009, where they took European Union states, not all of them, but most of them European Union states, and a couple of non-European states, and they made big regression models in which they tested a whole host of possible independent variables. So they tried to control for the economic development, for institutional structure, for the culture. I don't know, are Catholic countries better at protecting their environment than Protestant ones, for example? Does religion have anything to do with this? They looked at trade openness, they looked at EU membership, so they just threw a whole bunch of variables at the wall and they looked at what stuck. And overall, they find in their study, and you should probably look at that if you write the essay because that's one way to do it, they found that, well, actually most factors don't really explain all that much. The main thing that seems to explain in this selection of states why you are a leader in climate change policy is whether or not you're part of the EU. And if you weren't a part of the EU at some point in your history, and then you joined the EU, they say the model shows that that's when your environmental policies go through the roof. So for some reason, none of the other explanations really work, say Lieferink and others, but EU membership seems to be the best indicator that we have. So it's being a part of the EU that compels you to protect the climate. And then, of course, you can speculate about why that is. It's not a criterion to let you in. I mean, there's lots of economic criteria. There's no real criterion on you have to be this ambitious in climate change, you have to be this ambitious in climate change policy to join this ride. But overall, Lieferink also points out, because they're fair and they don't want to cheat us as the reader, is that overall the model doesn't work all that well. So they don't actually explain all that much variation. But of course, that doesn't mean that there's nothing going on. It just means that whatever the decision to adopt climate change policy seems to be really complex, seems to be multi-causal. It's not just we can point at one particular factor and say, well, clearly that explains why we adopt climate change policies or not. So there's clearly something going on, even though no one factor explains everything. If we look at prosperity, for example, do you have to be prosperous to a certain degree to allow yourself the luxury of also protecting the environment? Then we see that explanation, well, it's actually not all that bad. Again, most states seem to lie on sort of a 45-degree diagonal line that indicates that the higher your GDP per capita, horizontal axis, the better are your EPI scores. So you can't really have high EPI scores if you haven't reached a particular level of economic development. And there's not all that many states that deviate from this line all that much, even though, for example, a case like India is a surprising one because they have, the lines should sort of be here. So they're doing worse than their GDP per capita implies. Another way, maybe another factor we want to look at, and one that's interesting us as political scientists, is does this not have to do with political stability? Like I just said a minute ago, you need a stable political system, otherwise you'll never get around to adopting climate change policy because there's so much other stuff going on and so many other problems to deal with. And we see, holy cow, that is actually seems to be a pretty good explanation for this. I mean, for those of you currently in IPTA, R squared of 70.71. That's a really, really high correlation coefficient. So in other words, we can explain a lot of the variation in how well countries are doing environmentally, that's the horizontal scale, by looking at how fragile they are. You all remember the Fragile State Index from the sessions on democracy and regimes. So in other words, the more stable you are, the more likely you are to score high on environmental performance indicators. Now, it might not be a surprise to you, for example, that of course Somalia has other things to do than worry about climate change. They might have more immediate problems that they have to deal with. But I mean, still, it's interesting that one factor seems to explain that much, so much of the variation in how well states are doing on climate change. So maybe if we want to really combat climate change, what we should be doing is maybe we should be doing democracy building. Maybe we should help states become less fragile so they have the resources to deal with climate change, rather than just forcing them to adopt certain policies. At least that would be one way to interpret this graph. Now there's other levels that I already said in the beginning between global, supranational, national, subnational, and local. There's one other level that is interesting to look at and that I brought a study with me for, which is the regional level. So what does the regional level do? Regions, by the way, I now mean regions not in terms of the EU, but subnational regions. And this is interesting because in quite a few countries, the subnational units can, to a significant degree, set environmental policy. You can look to the US, for example, where you have a couple of US states, such as California, that have enacted much more ambitious climate change policies for their own territory than the US has adopted as a whole. And this is something that we see in quite a few other, at least Western countries, where subnational regional units have quite some leeway over what they want to do in climate change. And of course, this does make sense because oftentimes these units are the ones that actually have to implement the laws and safeguard the laws and sanction those that are breaking them or are breaking those goals. So the one thing, of course, that we need to keep in mind is we're talking about units here that have less policy capacity maybe than the national level. They can do fewer things than the national level. That's almost always the case. But they're also much more connected to the actual thing that they're supposed to protect, which is, of course, the natural environment. So there's kind of a tug of war going on. You have the people that are you have units that are the closest related to the thing you're supposed to protect, but they also have fewer powers than the level above them that could actually enable them to protect that very thing. So one of the ways, one of these studies that has been done on this particular explanation, it's about variation in how much regional units can do against climate change or for the environment, has actually been done by Nicola McEwen, of course, the original convener of this very course. So she published a paper together with a co-author in 2015 that looked at a intra-UK case. It pitted Scotland and its policies to protect the environment versus Wales and Wales's policies to protect the environment. So why are we doing this? Why is this an interesting comparison, given that it's not a transnational comparison in the first place? What are we doing comparing Scotland and Wales? Well, it's interesting because, of course, they are part of the same overall political system, but they have different levels of constitutional powers. Scotland can do quite a lot. Wales can't do all that much, at least on paper. So the hypothesis that McEwen and Royals came up with said that, well, we should expect that those regions that have more constitutional power should also be more ambitious in their climate change policy. You're given greater rights, so you will also exercise those rights and actually set more ambitious climate change goals. And then we have a second hypothesis that says that, well, in policy areas where you have more competences, you should also be more ambitious. Of course, not all areas of policy are devolved to Scotland, for example. Only a couple of them are, not all. So, but in those areas where powers have been devolved, we should see Scotland being more ambitious. And of course, being more ambitious than Wales, because Wales doesn't have all that many devolved powers in the first place. So this is a really interesting comparison because it controls for a lot of other things. For example, we can control for, I don't know, how well the nation is doing economically, because they're both part of the same nation. We can control for culture, because this is both part of the UK, and no offense to any Scots or Welsh here, but the differences between the Scots and the Welsh are probably less than, say, between the UK and Mongolia or something. So we can control for a good bit of variation already. So we try to figure out, we try to get at what is the most pure way to test for this factor of constitutional power, regional constitutional power. And this is how they set up that particular comparison. So what they did is they looked at two different areas. They looked at how ambitious are both regions in terms of their emissions and regulating those emissions, and how ambitious are they in terms of renewable energy, energy policy, energy efficiency, and so on. And bit of a spoiler alert, we find something interesting because McEwen and Royal, so on the top there you see that's our expected outcome. Scotland has quite a few devolved powers, Wales has few, so we would expect Scotland to be doing well in terms of emissions, right, and have quite some outputs and outcomes there. We wouldn't expect them to do all that well on energy simply because Scotland is still, or at least to a good part, reliant on non-efficient energy sources, at least in the past couple of decades. We weren't always sort of 60% renewable here. And for Wales, the opposite is true. Wales doesn't have a lot of devolved powers, so we wouldn't expect it to be particularly ambitious in its goals. But observed, we actually see that both of these regions are quite ambitious. So in a sense, this is an interesting study because it's one of those studies that starts with a pretty strong expectation, and that expectation just doesn't work out. Which means that for us, the lesson is you don't always write research that confirms your expectations. It's sometimes completely okay if your results subvert your own expectations. Because clearly in this case, they're both pretty ambitious, and this can be explained by the different constitutional powers. So an interesting study for you to look at because it's also very nicely set up. It gives you a good idea of how to design a study like this and really make this kind of focused comparison and figure out what the actual causes and effects here are. So one of the interesting explanations, for example, that comes out of the McEwen and Royals paper is, well, the British subnational regions are using progressive climate change policy to increase their distinctiveness. So they want to set themselves apart from sort of the larger national unit that they are a part of. And they want to say, well, Scotland is its own thing because we're much more progressive on climate change and the environment than the rest of the UK. So, and that's of course an explanation that we normally don't really consider, to adopt certain policies to increase your distinctiveness as a political unit. So again, an interesting study for you to look at and a good template for you to use for your essays maybe. So as a little summary, we need lots of conceptual clarity because environmental policies and climate change policies are such cross-cutting issues that touch so many different areas. Because there's outcomes and outputs that we need to keep separated from each other, and because there's several levels of policy making all the way from the local to the supranational level. And before you do any sort of research, before you touch your essay or write any particular sentence, you should know exactly what you're looking at. What's your dependent variable? What's your independent variable? At which level are you looking at? And how is this all going to fit together? And then ideally in your essay, you will also explain why you made that choice and why you think it was the right choice to make. Okay, that's it. I'll see you guys on Thursday.